this is learning background. If we understand God's dealing with Israel and His covenants with them, His feasts, and all of those things of how He dealt with them, it gives us a better understanding of how He's dealing with us as Gentiles. And some of the things that, have carried over into Christian tradition, like the Lord's Supper. You're like, in order to not be off track or confused about those things, it's important that we learn where they came from and where in the Bible these things are. And when we read, in the Gospels or where Paul writes about these things, we know what they're talking about. So it's background. And for me, it's interesting. And for you, it's probably interesting too. If it wasn't, you wouldn't be here. Because that's kind of been the foundation of this Bible study. That I know a lot of times I get off on kind of some tedious things that are important, but they can be kind of tedious. But we like to, look at a lot of the archaeological stuff and go back and get the background behind the things we read in the Bible and go into the history, and the archaeology and the places and the people, and try to get the whole, big picture there, which all of those things come together to give us a well-rounded biblical understanding and so forth. And it helps us be accurate in our understanding of the Bible. A lot of people don't think that's really important or necessary. I do. You probably do too, or you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have stuck with this Bible study all these years. So anyway, we're going to and this is stuff that it will be familiar to you. Over the next couple of weeks leading up to our Seder, we're going to review some things that are background to that. And on April 25th, we'll have all the stuff here. Some of you, or a lot of you, have been through, our Seder and everything. And it's really a lot of fun. It's very interesting and it's a lot of fun. So I would encourage you to come. And it's just, an extremely educational experience. It really is. First time, we began to look into these things and do that. It's really amazing. So anyway, let's pray and we'll get started with our study tonight. Father, we thank you so much for a good day and a good time to come here. We thank you for this wonderful place to meet. And Lord, we thank you for your good word, and that we have it. We can study it and understand it. Lord, we just pray as always that you'll give us insight and wisdom. And we know we gain that through accurate understanding of your word. So, Lord, lead us as we learn, and let these things equip us for our ambassadorship, that we'll be effective in that. And Lord, that we'll be good representatives for you in all things. Lord, we just love you. We thank you for loving us, and ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so two things we're going to kind of focus on tonight. We're going to look at some of the artifacts from Israel, and most of these things we're going to look at tonight are, let me straighten my deal up. Okay, this being photographs, let me kill this light and see. Can y'all see that a lot better? Okay, we're gonna kill that light because it would wash out the screen and you wouldn't be able to see these pictures otherwise. Okay.
Carson,
that good?
you.
Whatever.
Right hand, left hand.
Because I'm going to be writing on the board anyway. So these are some artifacts. This is the kind of pottery that Jewish people would have used in Jesus' time. These are 1st century AD Jewish everyday normal plates and jugs and bowls and kind of things that they use. They would have used in any normal everyday Jewish household. If they ate food off of a bowl or plate, that's what they would have eaten from. Jesus could have eaten off one of those. Or Peter, James, John, they could have eaten off of one of those plates. They're from 1st century. Okay, one thing I want to look at, finally remember to get me a new blue marker. We want to review tonight, because this is important to understand if we're going to look at the Seder and Passover. The 7 feasts of Israel. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because you really can in an hour or so, but we're going to name them and we'll do just kind of a quick review of the 7 feasts. First one is Passover, or Jewish name is Pesach. Second is unleavened bread. Is motzi or hamatzot, people call it. Third one is first fruits. Which is Bikurim. I write too fast, it's sloppy. Fourth, now, let me kind of divide this a little bit. We're going to practice writing divisions more than just, than how the Bible is divided up. There's kind of a division between these, let me go ahead and put this fourth one, is Pentecost. Shavuot. Then there's a period of several months. These 4 feasts are within 50 days of each other. Like Passover, actually about less than 60 days apart from the beginning of Passover to Pentecost. Then there's a period of time of about 3 or 4 months. And in September, it resumes the calendar of the feast with trumpets. And then the 6th one is the Day of Atonement. You hear of that one a lot. That one is Yom Kippur. We remember that name from the Yom Kippur War that they had there. And then the 7th is the Feast of Tabernacles. Which is Sukkot. Passover is in March or April, depending on when the full moon. It begins on like the first full moon after a certain number of weeks after the last feast, and so on. And there's the Jewish calendar, has some kind of quirky things about how they figure that they have an extra month every so often and so forth. But anyway, Passover begins the yearly series of feasts, and it is Passover's one day. That's when they prepare for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So let me put this up here. This is a 7-day feast. Now, Tabernacles is also a 7-day feast. Okay, if you look at Leviticus chapter 23, it gives details of these feasts. In it gives the instructions for these 7-day feasts. Passover is a 1-day feast. That's the preparation day. If you remember in the Gospels, when it's talking about how they had to bury Jesus before sundown after his crucifixion, because the next day was the preparation, or because that day was the preparation day, and so they had to have him buried before sundown, because the next day was a Sabbath. It was a special day, a special Sabbath. Well, the reason for that was because unleavened bread, which was a 7-day feast, the first day of the feast was a special Sabbath day, and the last day of the feast was also a Sabbath day. Now, during that 7-day period, you would have the normal weekly Saturday Sabbath fall in there somewhere. I mean, their feast days didn't always fall on the same day of the week, just like ours. I mean, Christmas can be any day of the week, depending on how the calendar cycle falls. So that's why we find, and I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but that's why we find a lot of misunderstanding about the Sabbath day during the accounts in the Gospels about Jesus' crucifixion, and they had to bury him before the Sabbath and so forth. Well, it wasn't the normal weekly Sabbath. It was the first day of unleavened bread. So anyway, my contention is that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday. Wednesday that week was Passover. The next day was the first day of unleavened bread. Which was a Sabbath day, and so they couldn't do any work. They didn't do anything. They rested, that day, treated it just like any other Sabbath day. Didn't do any work. And then Friday they prepared the spices and got all that stuff ready. And then it says the next day they rested on the Sabbath day, which was the normal weekly Saturday Sabbath. So it's important to at least have a basic understanding of these things, because when you read in the Gospels, if you don't understand the number of days of the feast, and that the first and last day of the feast were special Sabbath days, then that's where all the confusion has come in. People trying to squeeze 3 days and 3 nights into Friday and Saturday. And that's where we get the Good Friday and all that stuff. Not going into all that tonight, but anyway, it's amazing how if you just read the Bible, and this stuff, I learned this from just reading it. I went back into Leviticus and started reading those things. When I read through Leviticus 23, I said, wait a minute. Wait a minute. This gives a simple rundown of these feast days. And first and last day were Sabbath days. Normal weekly Sabbath fell in there somewhere. And I thought, surely I'm not the only one that has read this in the Bible. Well, come to find out, no, I wasn't. But anyway, establishment religion wants to stick with, Good Friday and all that stuff. Tradition. We can't let go of our tradition. But anyway, then first fruits is the first day after the last Sabbath of unleavened bread. Now, you have to be Jewish to be able to figure all that out and, keep up with all of it. But anyway, that was first fruits. And this came first fruits was immediately following unleavened bread. So Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits, those first 3 feasts of the year, all came just bang, 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 right in line, right consecutively together with no gaps in between. And then 50 days after, I think it's 50 days after that last Sabbath, I'd have to go back and read the details on that, is Pentecost, or Shavuot. And this is when they also, this is one of the 3 feasts, Passover and unleavened bread, and Pentecost. These were 2 of the feasts that all the men of Israel had to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, for 3 of these feasts. This feast, this one, and Feast of Tabernacles. They were required to go, I think it was Tabernacles. Or was it Yom Kippur? I'm thinking Tabernacles. But anyway, so 50 days after that last Sabbath, all the men especially, a lot of their families too, were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. That's why there were so many people there. And that's why there were so many Jewish proselytes from all of those other nations there when Peter and the other apostles were filled with the Spirit and began to speak in tongues, and all those people could understand them in their native languages. That's why they were there, is because that was one of the feasts where all the men were required to go to Jerusalem for the feast and so forth. So anyway, Pentecost, and we know all the things that happened there. Now, there's like the entire summer through the year, 90 feasts during there. Then the next one that comes in September is the Feast of Trumpets. We also know this is Rosh Hashanah, and it has some other significant things about that in the beginning of the governmental year, things like that. There's another word for it. I can't think of it right now. But anyway, Feast of Trumpets. And this is very significant because Israel looks to this as the ingathering of Israel. And this is one of the feasts that is like a festival, a positive type of festival feast and so forth. Now, with the trumpets is included Rosh Hashanah, and that includes like a certain days, certain number of days, I think it's 10 days, when they're supposed to have a time of repentance and so forth like that, preparing them for Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And that's when they, traditionally, before the temple was destroyed and all that, certain gifts they would give and sacrifices they would make to make atonement for their sins and those kind of things. I think it was the one where they would take the scapegoat, and lay their hands on the scapegoat and let it loose in the wilderness and kill the other goat and sacrifice it and all that. I think that was during atonement. I need to brush up on my 7 feasts.
Carson, is that typically Yom Kippur in September, October?
It's in October. Yom Kippur is in October, generally,
yeah,
is when it falls, sometime in October. And then the last, in all this, and I'm not going to go way into all this because there's a lot of it, I don't remember all the details. There's prophetic significance in all these feasts too. The things in Jesus' life and ministry and all the messianic prophecies mirror, these events and these feasts, or the feasts mirror events in the life and ministry of the Messiah, Israel's Messiah. Now, these especially mirror kind of end time events. Trumpets mirrors the ingathering, the atonement, which will be some things that take place at the end of the tribulation, and Christ dealing with the nation of Israel and so forth. And as a matter of fact, we looked at some of those scriptures last week. And then there'll be the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles, it also was a 7-day feast. The first day of the feast was a Sabbath. The last day of the feast was a Sabbath. Somewhere within that 7 days, your normal weekly Sabbath would fall. You treated it just like, a normal Sabbath. So, during that 7-day feast, you were going to have 3 of those days would be Sabbath days. Tabernacles was a very festive time. They would, go out and build booths out of palm limbs and things, either up on their housetops or in their yard or, wherever they could. They still do that. Matter of fact, in Israel, they still keep all of these feasts and things in some form or another. But tabernacles, they still do that pretty much like they've always done it. So, anyway, there's, special foods they have and all that. So Tabernacle is very festive time. And that ends the year, the feast year. And then after so many months, they start back over with Passover and so forth. So, quick rundown of the 7 feasts of Israel. The 2 we're going to be looking at for the Seder meal takes place during Passover and unleavened bread. And the reason why we eat unleavened bread, the matzah in the Seder, is because it begins the time of unleavened bread. They were supposed to take all of the leaven out of their house and dispose of it. And no kind of leavened bread or whatever. Comments they call it. So anyway, and we'll talk more about that when we do the Seder. Let's look at some more of these artifacts. And because there are some interesting things here in these. Okay, here's some oil lamps that are also, first century Israelite lamps. These were manufactured by the hundreds. They're not fancy. They're just your normal, common, everyday oil lamps, and they would have had a little wick that went in the spout there, and they poured olive oil in the top. Now, these look like they may have had some kind of lid, but normally they didn't. And even though, and here's one thing that we found out by experiment, and then after the experiments, researched it and found out that was the case. If we were going to use one of these lamps, we would take that lamp, put the wick in there, and then we would do what? We would fill it up with oil, right? Seems logical, seems reasonable. Do you know that they didn't do that? Do you remember the story in Matthew 25, Jesus told about the 5 wise virgins and the 5 foolish virgins? The wise virgins took oil with their lamps, so their lamps wouldn't go out. The 10 foolish virgins didn't. Okay, well here's what we found out. Even though by the size and shape of those lamps, logically you would think, fill it up with oil. You don't fill it up with oil. Because if you fill it all the way up with oil, that lamp wick will wick the oil right out, and it'll just steadily run down. And there's some other reasons too. You only put enough oil in that lamp to keep it burning. Ever so often, you're going to have to go back and put more oil in there. You don't fill it all the way up. That's just, it doesn't work as well. It doesn't burn as well. It's not as efficient. If you keep it full, it will run out, it'll wick out, and you have a big oily mess everywhere. Plus, it can catch fire. So, anyway, unlike what we might just normally logically think, that's not the way they use these. They didn't just keep them full all the time. They had another vessel, like one of these back here, that they would have kept and just, replenish the lamp when it needed it. Here's another typical clay, kitchen vessel bowl they would have used. Now, these over here don't really have anything to do so much with Passover or anything we're talking about. These are weights, scale weights, used in their merchant shops or whatever for trading and so forth. They were very meticulous in their weights and standards. And one of the interesting things that are very common in archaeological finds and are always exciting to find are weights. And usually they're pretty easy to identify. Now sometimes they may be plain, just pieces of stone like this. Sometimes they may be very ornate, very polished, fine, almost works of art. And if a set of those weights are ever found, it's really really a super fine find. Now, here's one thing that we want to take a look at. This looks like just a plain Jane cup of some kind, like a drinking cup. Okay. You may not be able to really tell it in this photograph, but that cup right there is not made of clay. I mean, these other things we've looked at, these things are all made of clay. Normal daily use things, they would use clay. This cup right here is not made of clay. It's made of limestone. Now, think about the amount of work it took to make that cup. You had to be a really good stone worker to make that cup and not break it while you're... they were really skilled artisans. The Jews were some of the only ones that made stone cups like this. There's a reason why they made stone cups like this. Okay. One of the things that they had to do in preparation for, especially for these feasts, but really all these feasts, there were certain things they had to do, and that was certain purifications. In fact, unleavened bread, one of the whole points of that was purification, purifying their house of all leaven. And go through the mikveh and all those kind of things, and wash, and had all these purifications they had to do. And if you had done something like been around Gentiles or touched a dead body, well, you were impure, and you had to go through this long ritual of so many days before you could, go and celebrate the feast and take part in that. So, here's what the Jews believed. And may have been some practical reason to believe this. Clay vessels clay vessels could be contaminated because they were porous. So they made these stone vessels because they believed that anything in that stone vessel was purified. Now, there are some practical reasons for that too. There are some chemical things that happen, between clay and what you put in it, and bacteria and things like that. There are also some chemical things that happen with stuff that you put in a limestone vessel. Because limestone is, there's certain, there's calcium, there's some, I think, certain level of sodium in there. Some acids can take place and things like that. So there's some practical reasons why they went to the trouble to make these stone cups and so forth to keep their stuff pure. Now, they didn't use these every day. These were special just for the feast days when everything had to be kept pure. Let's see. Well, let me go back. Let me just stay right here. I've got some other pictures of some others of this we'll look at in a second. But I want to go ahead and make this comment about that. Okay. We've all, seen pictures, we've seen it in the movies or some TV show or some kind of deal where they're always talking about the Holy Grail, and there's about the Holy Grail and the cup that Jesus drank from at the Lord's Supper. And every time you see a picture of the Holy Grail, it's some, kind of like chalice-shaped kind of thing. Well, we wouldn't have that on. I'm thinking of something else. Here we go. Chalice-shaped type of thing with all kind of, jewels and all kind of stuff on it, and it's very ornate and all this kind of stuff. Expensive thing. Well, the reality is the cup that Jesus drank from at the Lord's Supper would have looked like that. It would have been one of these. It would have been a limestone cup that's what they would have had there because it was Passover and beginning the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so things had to be pure. They had to be purified. One of the elements in the Seder that we'll observe is there's a part of it's the hand washing ritual there, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So anyway, limestone cup, 1st century AD, they would have used in their Seder that night. The Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, would have looked something like that. This is first century street right outside the Temple Mount. And I think the reason I took this picture is because these holes here are, well, these are like hinge posts for a door. There was like a double door right here for something, and that's why that's there. Now, this is the remains of a first century street. The reason I took this photo, it's interesting to me, it might not be to anybody else, but it shows the construction methods that mainly the Romans used in building streets, and how they built the foundation and all of the fill and rubble beneath the paving stones that they used and so forth. Now, the reason these stones are crushed in and this hole is right here in the street is because this is right outside the Temple Mount, and I'll show you in a second. When they destroyed the temple in 70 AD and they shoved all those huge blocks down there in the street, it caused all this damage right here. Here is a really not all that good picture of the inside of a mikveh. And if you're familiar with what a mikveh was one of the ritual baths that the Jews used. Let me go to the next picture because it's better. This is like the same thing, but here's where I'm standing looking down into it. Here's I'm standing up over it looking down. You can see there's a set of steps going down here, and there's kind of a partition here, and then there's steps coming up. Generally, the mikveh had like I think 7 steps going down. They would, they had separate ones for women and separate ones for men. They would take off their clothes, go down there, wash in the mikveh, and these had an ingenious system of actually running water. So the mikveh that they used for their ritual washing and their understanding of baptism had water running through it all the time. It was living water. It wasn't just a pool of standing water, but it had to have a flow of water through it all the time, where it wouldn't have filled the requirements for their purification. So anyway, very ingenious how they had this set up. They would go down one side, wash, come out the other side, put on clean clothes, and then they could go up to the temple to wash. The pool of Siloam was a washing place for numerous people when they came to worship at the temple. They had to do that. They had to go through this baptism, this washing, to be worthy to then go and worship at the temple. If they didn't do that, they weren't allowed to go up there. They were impure. They were unclean. So, and it took a lot of work to. This is all cut out of solid rock, so it took a lot of work to do it. Limestone. And this is just right outside the wall of the Temple Mount. And these things are from the 1st century AD, around about that time. Now, this could have been in use for, decades, maybe hundreds of years. It could have been built in, century before Christ and been used for, 100 years or 200 years, possibly. The apostles may have used this, very likely. This is one of the water channels that came down from, up the Temple Mount, possibly even like the pools of Bethesda, because that supplied water to the Temple Mount and the temple and all the water they had to have there. Very ingenious system of supplying water and drainage system that went all the way down into the Kidron Valley there. This is one of the water channels that was partially cut out of the solid rock, and certain places where they had built it up with masonry and so forth. This is one way they think they moved all those large stones. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not really what we're talking about. It's kind of an idea they think of how they moved, and they just stuck wheels on the big block and pulled it with oxen. That's a crane there. All of this level here is 1st century AD. These walls, these stones, things, those would have been there during Jesus' day. He may have, walked in that very part of the city. I'm drawing over. There's some Canaanite vessels and so forth. I'm going to skip past all that because it's not really relevant to what we're talking about. Here's Canaanite clay coffins. Amazing number of these have been found intact. The Canaanites, possibly some of the Philistines in like late Bronze Age would bury their dead, and they would make these clay coffins and so forth and bury their dead. Now, it's interesting, all of the faces on these coffins all look different. So there's reason to believe that the faces on the coffin were somewhat resemblance of the person that was buried in there. It's interesting, the burial practice. Here's a creepy looking, mask. This one of the ceremonial Canaanite or Philistine ceremonial masks that I think represented Baal. So anyway, it was an evil spirit. I don't remember if it was in this class. We were talking about a lamellic jar. It's one of those things that was stamped with the signature of a king, one of the kings of Israel, and also had the name of the city where it came from, paying tribute and so on. Well, this is a handle of a lamellic jar, and it has like a scarab and the winged symbol on there. Not sure, I don't remember the details. I think it was a Hezekiah lamellic jar symbol there. And anyway, a good example of a lamellic jar. Okay, here we go. Here's some more of these limestone vessels. Now look at that cup. I mean, that looks like any coffee cup any of us would have in our kitchen. But this cup is made out of solid limestone. Now you can see the cracks in it, so it was excavated, not intact, but all the pieces were there. They were able to reconstruct it. It's made of limestone. Now, I mean, it took some really good craftsmanship to make that cup out of that limestone. It makes you wonder how many of those did they break trying to, make it. But anyway, the cup Jesus drank from in the Lord's Supper, their Seder that night, could have looked exactly like that cup right there. So this whole, Holy Grail, big jeweled chalice thing, the chalice really was a pagan vessel that they used in their worship ceremonies.
Were the cups like a standard size cup?
Yeah. That you could take that cup and set it beside one of our coffee cups, and they would be about the same size. Maybe a little bigger, maybe a little larger, but generally, they're finger hole in there. It'd be just like one of ours. Now, I don't think I've got any pictures of it in here, but one of the really neat things to find is one of these limestone cups that has two handles. Now, the two-handled cup is two-handled limestone cup is one that they used in their hand washing rituals, because they would fill the cup up with water, and then they would take one handle and they would pour water on that hand and wash that hand. Then they would grab the other handle with that washed hand, and they would wash the other hand, so that both hands were washed and purified without having to touch that, this unpurified hand that started off with. Once it touched that handle was not pure anymore. So this, you had the two-handled cup, and that way they could wash their hands. And I've seen Jewish people do this. I've watched them go when they wash their hands. That's the way they do. That was part of the ritual that Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for. If you remember that time when he told them, "Look, you guys, when they said, 'Hey, your disciples are eating bread with unwashed hands.'" Well, it didn't mean that their hands were dirty, that they hadn't washed their hands. They just hadn't gone through all of this ritual, and all this stuff. So, nothing wrong with it. You have clean hands. Anyway, this would have been just a drinking cup, but it's made of limestone, which it's pure. And this box back here, go ahead.
Just think about that, with the tools that they had to make that stuff with.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't have a Home Depot or Lowe's to go by and get a grinding tool to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they,
And
okay.
the skill would be at something else.
Along that lines, these are the same thing. These are made out of solid limestone. You remember in the story where Jesus went to Cana of Galilee, to the wedding there, and it says, they ran out of wine, and it says that there were set there 7 water pots of stone, not of clay, not of pottery, but of stone. And that was because that water had to be pure water. It had to be purified, because in part of their wedding stuff, they had to have, pure water, and there were people there. There were probably, synagogue rulers or Pharisees or some, of the Jews, that they had to have the purified water. So that's why in that story in John's Gospel, at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, it says there were set there however many water pots of stone. Now, if you understand the Jewish customs of using these water pots of stone to keep their water pure, and why they did this, then you understand how important that detail is in that gospel account of those water pots of stone. So these are just like what they would have had there at Cana of Galilee at the wedding. And when they filled them up with water, Jesus turned it into wine and so forth. So, along those lines, here's one of the things that archaeology can't tell us, and history can't tell us. Things that are commonplace, so commonplace that we don't know how they did it. To them, to do this, they had to have some type of lathe type deal, because these things are perfectly round. I mean, they're, you can tell there's the scribed lines around them, and how they somehow attached these and had tools that they could cut inside, cut all that stone out while that thing was turning. And the educated guess or speculation on that is that they made these things in some place where they had a lot of water, and it was a wet, muddy, messy job to make these things, because they just had water pouring on them all the time. And with these bits they'd cut in there, and certain ways they believe they would wrap the outside with leather bands or something to keep it from vibrating and chattering. And also there was a lot of engineering, really smart engineering. Let me think about this. Okay, what if somebody gave us the task? Okay, Grace Bible Study Group, here's your task. We want you to go out and get yourselves a block of limestone, and we want you to make one of these limestone pots. I wouldn't even really know where to begin. And think about how many busted up, cracked pieces of limestone we'd have laying around till we learned how to do this. I mean, it took some craftsmen to be able to make these things, So
Discovery Channel tells us that aliens did it.
Well, might be. From the planet Nibiru. But these kind of things are amazing, and that so many of these have survived. Now, most of these, were found cracked or so forth, but all the pieces were there, and they were able to glue them back together, piece them back together. Sometimes they do excavate some of these that are intact and unbroken. It really, to me, it gives me a lot of understanding, and I can picture in my mind, gives us a more accurate view of what the Bible's talking about. And when it talks about vessels of stone, it's not talking about vessels of clay. Clay is clay, stone is stone. And so here's archaeology shows us, yes, that these details in the Bible were true and accurate, and this is what these things, that's what they look like.
Did they drink out of those, or were those vessels just
They-
to hold water?
Well,
Whatever.
yeah, these would have been for
Because they look like
drinking.
they have a little lip or
Yeah, they would have been able to put some kind of top, either probably like a cloth top over those, and tie a string around it or something that to keep bugs or dirt or whatever out of it. So yeah, they more than likely would have been able to put some kind of covering over those and tie it, with them having that lip and so forth. Now, there's reason to believe that they would also put rope or cordage around these the tops and suspend them. These vessels would hang a lot of times. They could come up and just grab the bottom and pour out of them instead of having to dip in there. But they would use them for drinking water and for washing water too. Whatever they needed purified water for, that's what they would keep in these vessels. And if it came from a clean running water source, it was considered pure water. And if it went straight into that vessel, then it was considered pure water, good for whatever they needed. Even cooking their unleavened bread and kosher food for the Passover, they had to have pure water. So.
And also on that mikvah that you were talking about, was that flowing water that flowed through there all the time, or did they take water in there and manually fill it up?
No, it had a way for flowing water. Water flowed in and water flowed out. And now, probably not year round, because they didn't need it year round. Certain places, like the pool of Siloam, it was a year-round place of running water that they could go and purify themselves before going up to the temple. Some of these mikvah probably were only used when they needed to be used. So, when they needed to use the mikvah, they'd go down there, they would pull the thing out or channel the water to that, and use it. And then when they didn't need it anymore, shut the water off and the water would drain out.
Well, the temple was on a mountain.
Yeah.
Just like Olympus, where they had to have spring water or something that.
Yeah,
Somebody channeled it from the spring to get it there.
Let's see if I can draw this in profile. I wish I had I don't think I have a bird's eye view on there. Anyway, okay, let me see if I can kind of draw this in profile from the west. All right, let's say the Temple Mount is here, and it kind of slopes down the city of David in the Kidron Valley. Mount of Olives over here. Okay. On the uphill side of the Temple Mount area, you have I'm just going to draw it like that. The pool of Bethesda. Bethesda pool, which was a spring-fed pool. Now, I didn't really draw that right. It is slightly higher than the Temple Mount area, where the temple and all of the stuff, the mikvahs and all this stuff we're looking at here, is a little bit higher. And in the ground north of it even slopes up a little higher. So there's the spring like right there that feeds the pools of Bethesda. One of the reasons that they built the things they did there, not just because there was a spring, But they channeled the water out of these springs, collected them in the pool. The reason the pools of Bethesda are there to begin with is that they were built in like 7th century, I think, maybe even earlier than that. Yeah.
As cisterns.
They were built as water holding tanks to supply the temple and all the water that they had to have there. I mean, remember, they're going in there in the morning and making sacrifices. They're going back in the evening and making sacrifices. That's just on the normal weekdays. And then you take a feast day, and everybody's bringing sacrifices in there. So, just to be graphic about it, it was a bloody mess with all those animals that they sacrificed there. Plus, all the people going up there and all that, there was a lot of stuff that needed to be washed out of there. Plus, all of the washings that the priests had to do. They had to wash their clothes. They had to wash themselves. They had to wash all their utensils and all those vessels and all that temple stuff. Constantly washing and doing the rituals and all those things. It was a tremendous amount of work and took a lot of them to do it. So anyway, the main water source for the Temple Mount was the pools of Bethesda, and that's why and I don't have any pictures in this PowerPoint. We may look at some next week since we hit on the subject. That's why they built these huge, big pools there, was for water supply for the Temple Mount. Because the spring, especially back in those days, was a fairly consistent flow, but they needed reservoirs of water. Because there were times in the temple when they needed lots of water, but not all the time. So anyway, just the normal flow of the spring, if they just channeled that down there would have been times when that wouldn't have been enough. So that's why these are here. That's where the water comes from. That even though this is on the mountain, it's not the highest point in that ridge that it sits on. There's higher ground, and that's where its water comes from.
Are they still active today, though, the springs?
Kind of yes and no. There's water there, but the way that I'm going to have to get that. We'll have to look at that PowerPoint. I'm going to tell you that the pools of Bethesda is a really interesting place. Kind of creepy in a way, but it's an interesting place because of so much that has gone on there over the centuries and how important it was. Standing up there on the present day level, you're looking way down in this hole that's been excavated out, down to the level of what would have been the normal kind of the level where the spring was in Jesus' time. And yeah, there's water down there. Now it's not bubbling up anywhere because, the aquifer's lower down because of usage and so forth. So the spring's not as active as it was, but it still is there because there's still water down there, and there's still, a pool down there. But it's low and not anything like it was back in those days. Even the Gihon spring, it's still an active spring bubbling up out of there, but apparently not anything like it was back in, first century times even. So yes, the mikveh had flowing water. Water flowed in, water flowed out when they used it. But it wasn't just all the time, constant. Because their water was limited, and they ran water in it when they needed it, and didn't when they didn't. Okay, yeah, water pots of stone. So the Pontius Pilate inscription there was a very important artifact that was found that proved Pontius Pilate was the character in the Bible. He was a real person. There's a Roman helmet. This is a street there in the Jewish part of the market there, Jewish quarter. Very neat and clean, as you can see. And that's a kind of a typical scene as you go in the Damascus Gate on El Wad Street. A market that I guarantee you, if you could get in a time machine and go back in time, their streets and markets would look just like they do now. Different stuff, but some things don't change. It's a very is interesting. So anyway, I want to look at a couple of those things, mainly those stone water pots and the stone drinking vessels, just because those are important. It gives us an idea of some of the things they use. One more element in our understanding of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and so forth. Next week we'll look at a couple other things. We're going to look at the Pool of Bethesda there, because there are some interesting things about that. We'll look at that. Some more of these details coming up. We'll probably maybe look at a couple of things, the Seder meal, because it gives us a little more background, and we, won't really be able to cover everything in great detail when we have the Seder. So anyway, any questions or comments or anything?
Carson, I know over the years that when you made the trip over there, when here in the States, when we want to go from one generation to the next, we knock it down and move to someplace else. There, they just keep building on top of it.
Yeah.
And that was always interesting to me,
Yeah.
how the artifacts from that day and time is just there. It's just a matter of getting down to it.
Yeah, and by using that practice there, it is given a stratified record.
That's what it is.
Now it's not always absolutely complete, but when you put this excavation together with what you see in this excavation and that one over there, and you put all that together, you get a really accurate view of what happened when and who was where and what, everything. What they ate, what they grew, what they used for medicine, how they traded, what their families were like, what their houses were like, and all that stuff. Because, just like that, if the city was destroyed or whatever, they just built right on top of it, just leveled everything off and built right on top of it.
I know there was some of the articles and some of the pictures you showed a couple of years ago of where the walls and some of the structures were still there.
The mud brick,
The mud brick was still there, and they just built on them or around them
Yeah.
or through them or incorporated them into
Yeah.
their new buildings.
yeah, and some of there's a Roman wall there at Tel Asafi, and they just built right through some of the old stuff that was, I don't know, 1,000 years old when the Romans were there and built their wall through there. Then the Crusaders came and they built on top of that stuff,
right.
So they all leave their traces and everything right there.
I didn't realize until you showed us in your pictures and told us that the real city is below, street level.
Yeah.
I didn't even
Matter of
think
fact,
about that. That's amazing.
And that's one of the things I thought I had it in this PowerPoint, but I didn't. Next week, wanted to look at the more of in the place where the mikvah was. That's a place where there's first century AD street right outside the Temple Mount. That is one of the places that more than likely Jesus was here.
Absolutely.
If he walked in this area, he would have walked on this street. These stones right here. A lot of places you don't know because the modern city, it's 8 or 10 feet above the first century level. Some places deeper than that, depending on what they've built over it. But in the excavations they get right down to where it's identifiable places, and Jesus was here. And what you're looking at, he saw the same thing. You're Peter and Paul and James and John and all, and so it's pretty interesting.
But everybody believes when they're walking on street level, that's where Jesus walked.
Yeah, and it's funny, that they've got all the stations of the cross along the Via Dolorosa and all that, and all these groups of pilgrims, and they're carrying crosses, and they're kissing the wall and all this kind of stuff. You've got to tell them, look, it wasn't here. This is not the actual place. And so a lot of, it's one of those things where history and archaeology give us accurate details that make these things come alive and make them put you there, makes it understandable, and shuts a lot of mouths that want to contradict or or claim that the Bible's not true, or it's fable or whatever. And you find the artifacts that back up the details.
Right.
And there it is. It supports the historicity of the Bible. And it's very important. Sure is. Okay.
Unleavened bread falls immediately after Passover, the day after Passover. Are they related as far as one holiday, one feast, or what?
Yeah. On Passover, they would have begun to eat unleavened bread beginning with the Passover meal, because part of the Passover day, the preparation day, one of the things they did on that day was, they sacrificed the lamb and cooked it and got all those things together. One of the things they did was get rid of all the leavening in their house. So starting with specifically the Passover meal, no more leavened bread. And so from that point on, that began their eating unleavened bread for 7 days. And that's they could eat meat, vegetables, and other foods too. But as far as their bread stuff, they didn't eat any kind of leavened bread or anything with bread yeast in it. One of the things, here's something that I learned, an interesting detail. I won't talk about it now. We'll talk about it at the Seder. Anyway, I'm not even going to go into it now. We'll just wait. It's very interesting. And yeah, it's very interesting, and it gives a lot of insight to these things. And we'll talk about it then. Go ahead.
Have you, when you were there, did you ever get to walk where Jesus walked?
Yeah, and matter of fact, this street that I was talking about in the Davidson Center, they've excavated this first century street, and it's the place where, in fact, we're over time, but I've got the PowerPoint here. We can look. A lot of those blocks are still laying in that street from that destruction, and there are other things that show this is the street that was here when Jesus, during his life and ministry. And when he came to the temple, he would have walked on this street. So yeah, you're walking, you're standing there in a place, looking around and thinking, I'm looking at the remains of what Jesus would have seen when he stood right here. And the Pool of Siloam is the same place. They know absolutely that's it. This is the Pool of Siloam. They found it in 2005. They're putting in either a water line or a sewer line. And they digging through there, and they begin to hit these large flat stones. And so as they do over there, when they're excavating and they hit something that they know is a ruin or something, they stop and investigate it. Some of the archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority, they had a pretty good idea that somewhere in that area probably was the Pool of Siloam. So sure enough, when they hit these blocks, they said, that's it. And they excavated down there, sure enough, there it is. And so that's one of those places, when you stand there, Jesus, you can put it, Jesus was here, And so, yeah, there are places you can go that you know absolutely that Jesus would have been there,
How did that make you feel?
I can't describe it. It's I don't know. It's gives you a sense of connection, and I don't know. It just makes the Bible so much more real, and relatable. It's like if you've ever been to any historic place, like I don't know, someplace where George Washington was, and you stand here and you're thinking, or like if you've ever been to a Civil War battlefield, that's pretty much like it was during one of those Civil War battles. And you're standing there and you're looking around and you're thinking, I always picture a battlefield as some vast, it's like right there, and you're thinking, this old oak tree, it was here then. That old house right there, that was there. So the soldiers that were here fighting, if they were right here where I am, I'm seeing the same things they saw, So it's that sense of a historical connection. But, you know, being Christians, it's more than that. So it's hard to describe, really. But that's why, you know, we encourage anybody, if they get the chance to go, they should go over there and, you know, and walk around and look.
And we got to see a portion of the real Via Dolorosa,
Yeah,
which is underground,
yeah,
so it's not on level ground.
yeah. But, you know, it's Jerusalem's just like all these other cities you're talking about.
Yeah,
It's been destroyed and built and destroyed and built and destroyed and built, you know. So it becomes a tale itself. Interesting stuff. All right. Anybody else? Got anything?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
All right, good discussion. Let's pray and we'll close for tonight.